Good afternoon. First, thank you all so much for being willing to come out and spend this time with me. And thank you for inviting me into your lovely home. I appreciate that.
You're very welcome.
The thing with this is to always try and find out where should one start. And a journey of 23 years of self-discovery, self-realization. There are so many moments that led to the aha moment. But my life started in Jackson, Tennessee. I was born to a beautiful mother who was an educator, loving activist, married a gentleman from Accra, Ghana, who was a military man, educator, hard worker. I had the things that one would expect to have on a path of success. My parents were present, they were loving, they were authoritative, and I still found my way into San Quentin with a life sentence. Now, I didn't start out being a person who was prone to antisocial behavior. I did not break into places. I did not beat up on people. It wasn't my thing. I didn't sell drugs. But the crack cocaine epidemic had a lot to do with me being removed and sent to California. Where I grew up, small town Jackson, the crack cocaine epidemic was very, very strong. And many of my friends started to die. We were young men, 17, 18, 15 in some cases, dying because of the crack cocaine epidemic. My mother had decided that that would not happen to her boys because she had several boys. My stepfather had been deported back to Ghana. So we grew up in a very violent environment, and my mother was responsible for keeping these boys safe and free. Seeing that the blazes of the crack cocaine epidemic was closing in on her family, and understanding her children well enough to know that Dameion had an issue with being told what to do by people, she knew that that was not going to be a good combination. So she told me I had to go. I didn't want to go, but she sent me to the bus station under escort for my older brothers. And when they come and mother has delivered that word, you're going to go. So I found myself coming out to San Jose, California. Now, I'm a Southern child all my days, but there were some things that really struck me in the moment that let me know that my life would be very different in this state. The first of which was when I came through Barstow. I noticed when I got to the city, I couldn't see the stars. Now, I didn't know about this thing called light pollution. I'd never experienced it in Jackson, Tennessee. I could see the Milky Way. I could find Ursa Major, Ursa Minor, and I couldn't see any of those things. And I remember articulating, this is not my sky. Then I noticed how close the homes were together. I had never seen this. Only in the projects were homes this close together. And I kept wondering, when I would get to the city, would I see yards, space, in the way that I experienced it in Tennessee? I did not. My final realization that I was in a strange land was when I was looking for a job. A gentleman came across my path and he said, "How you doing?" Now, from the South, when you say how you doing, that's a conversation. I stopped to share with him that I'm a new arrival in California, and he was about 10 paces past me. So I understood that our language in the South was not the same language in the West. So if you just wanted to keep moving, you said, howdy, hey, hi. But if you wanted a conversation, you asked the question. So I found myself working very early, and it made me appreciate California because I could not find work in Tennessee. And I got a very false sense of my own abilities because I came across some things very easily and very quickly when I first got to California, which didn't give me time to build the muscle of earning and understanding the value of things that I had accumulated. So I thought that, well, this is just my ability. There was no fortune involved in this. So I made a decision to go back to Atlanta, being that I was missing the South. I went to Atlanta because the gentleman who had given me my first job opportunity in San Jose had left and went to the South and opened a restaurant, and he wanted me to help him run it. And he offered me part ownership. Now, as a 20-year-old, like, ownership of a restaurant? So I went, broke all the rules of what I knew to be. I uprooted my family. It was a unilateral decision. I did not converse with my wife about that. And being from the South, that was kind of typical that she would just acquiesce to what my decisions were. When I uprooted my family and went to the South, my hell began. So I decided to come back to California. I asked my wife to stay with her dad for 3 months and let me reestablish. That went very badly. The reason that I asked her to stay with her dad is because her dad told me upon our wedding evening, if she ever displeases you, if you ever have problems of any kind, don't leave her out there. That's not where you found her. You bring her home. And I said, yes, sir. So I brought her home. And I told him that she has not displeased me in any way. I have let my family down and I need to reestablish. He said, take all the time you need. So when I came back, the pride that I felt wouldn't allow me to go back to the job that I was at and admit that I had failed. I drove up to Union Bank's parking lot. If I drove there once, I drove there 15 times and could not bring myself to get out of that car and go back in there and get that job that they had told me would be there for me if I changed my mind. That pride, that arrogance, that naivety led to me spending 23 years in prison. So, my entry into San Quentin, the first day when I walked into West Block, there were these very large, very talkative guards giving the rundown about how things was going to be. This day I had my bedding in my right hand, my effects from the county jail in my left hand, and I was standing over a puddle of mud. And we had stood there so long that my bedding had started to slip off my fingers. And there was a large gentleman beside me, a guard, mirrored shades, the full guard starter kit. And he looked over at me. He was about he was at least 6'9". He was about my dad's height. And I saw him watching my bedding about to fall in the mud. And being a person from the South, having some expectation of common courtesy or decency, I thought perhaps he would nudge it so that I could get a better grip on it and hold it. He watched it as it fell into the mud. And of course, I had an attitude in my youth, so I picked it up, threw it over my shoulder, and I looked ahead with a very angry face. And he said to me, he said, son, this is your first lesson in prison. You carry your own weight and you clean up your own dirt. About 15 minutes later, I will receive my second lesson in prison. I went into Carson section. Carson section is a section reserved for those who have 10 years or more to do in prison. I had a life sentence. So having that life sentence, when I walked through those gates and I saw 5 tiers and mostly black and brown hands on those bars, I could not help but to think about the diagram in the history books of a slave ship. And it was then that I said to myself, what did I get myself into? So when I went inside of the cell, there was a gentleman in the back of the cell. And for those who have seen San Quentin, you know it's not much of a cell. You can touch the walls like this. 2 of us were there. He was doing something on the floor. I later found out that he was sharpening a knife. He turned around and he said, hey, where you from? I said, Tennessee. He said, no, where you from in California? I said, San Jose. He said, do you have a knife? I said, no. Why would I have a knife? He said, put your bags down. Let me show you how to make one. That was my second lesson in prison. Now, I was a young man who had never done drugs, ever. I never tried marijuana. I never tried a cigarette. I never tried alcohol. I was a sportsman. And I bit into the belief that it would stunt your performance. So I was very clean and clear. But the only thing available to us at the time when I went in was NA and AA. So I didn't see a need for either of those things. And so when I went inside, just to break the monotony of prison life, I noticed that men were passing weapons. They were passing notes that hits was going to go down on. And many of them were utilizing drugs and alcohol. So I knew that wasn't a place that was a benefit to me. There was some in there who were very sincere, but the others were there as well. And I knew that staff knew this. So I didn't go. Then I started to create an African history development course because I had experienced something earlier that moved me to want to have a safe haven for people who would go through those things that I had gone through. Now, what I had gone through was heavy recruitment to be in a gang. I was raised by my parents to never, ever enter a gang. Mind your steps and mind your deeds so that you not need anyone to help you out of troubles. That was my philosophy. Now, the manner in which it was done was very clever. Envelopes were slid under the cell door. And within those envelopes contained several constitutions of various gangs. Now, the trick is, you open the envelope and you read the contents. You know intimate information. Therefore, you are now a member. So be on the yard and we will give you the rundown as for how things go. Well, I had been warned about that. So when those envelopes would come under the door, I would kick them back. Never read them. But one day we were on the yard and a fist fight broke out. A fist fight. And the guards shot a live round from a Mini 14. It was a fist fight. I had never known a police officer on the street. Well, maybe in 2020 they do it regularly. But at that time, I had never known for a police officer to be able to walk up on a fist fight and shoot someone. But they could do it inside. At that point, I said to myself, I may never make it out of here. The realization of a life sentence and what that meant to a young man of 23 was, I can't see forever in here. So when I came back to my cell that day, I made a decision not to end my life because I didn't have what it took to take my own life. I made a decision to give someone else an opportunity to take my life if they could earn it. So the next morning when I woke up and all of the envelopes came under the door, I collected them all. And I read each and every one of them. Tore them up, flushed them. When the yard was ready to open, gentlemen came to the door and they said, "Hey, did you read the envelope?" I said, "Yes." So we'll be on the yard. We need to give you the rundown. Why is that? You're in. Well, what am I in exactly? Because I read them all. They weren't happy with that response. So a series of attacks began. And I found myself spending time in the hole because I was very adamant about my dislike of joining gangs. And when my mother, may she rest in peace, when my mother had seen me in the courtroom, when I was facing this forever sentence, and the judge asked me, "Do you understand the sentence as it has been read down to you?" I said, "No." And my mother, in her calm, strong, determined voice, said, "Dameion." And I looked over my shoulder. She said, "Come home, the son I raised." Now, those were my marching orders. That's what I took with me. That was my filter through which I ran every experience that I faced. And the greatest shame that I could endure was not being, in my mother's eyes, the child she raised. There was hope and there was pain in that statement. Did she mean that I was not at that moment? Or did she have faith that I would be home and I would be better? I didn't know. But it was the fuel that drove me to be who I am. So these were the things that kept me focused. But even with that, I was overlooking one very important thing. I had never looked inside of myself to find out where my shortcoming was. And the reason I had not done that is because when I was sentenced, I was accused of things that I did not do. But there were things that I did do. But because there were things that I didn't do, I hid behind those things to keep me from looking at the things that I was guilty of. About 7 years into my sentence, I started to face those things. And seeing other young men come into the prison, being afraid and funneled into the gangs, being funneled into positions that they did not want to be in, I felt it necessary to create the African History Cultural Development course. Not so much thinking that they would come in and want to learn these things, because one thing I've certainly learned is that civilizations are not built at their best in times of war, but in times of peace. And when young men enter a situation like prison, that's equivalent to a time of war. So they throw off the non-essentials. Survival takes precedent. I simply wanted to create an umbrella of protection for these young men, because sometimes it works this way, many times it works this way in prison. If you hold the Bible, if you hold the Quran, then the gangs may leave you alone. If you are progressive, Pan-African, the gangs may leave you alone. But there's always someone watching, hoping to catch you beneath that umbrella to call you a hypocrite and make you a legitimate target. That's how it works. So I provided that And in talking to those young men, they provided me with something that would lead to me doing the things that I do today. Those young men started to share with me their pasts, their upbringing. And I could see myself in a lot of the things that they had faced. And the reason that I made myself available to them is because I was a father. And I left my children out there. So I felt that if I take everything that I have and I try to help someone else's child, karma will see to it that someone would do the same thing for my children. So maybe it was a little selfish, but it was what I had. So I gave what I could to them, and they in turn gave me insights into my own shortcomings. And I learned better how to communicate with my children. I could see the errors that I was making as a dad. And I wrote my children incessantly. And I would always say, well, I wrote you guys letters all the time. My son was like, Dad, those weren't letters, those were dissertations. Because there was a desperation. Because I did not think that I would make it home. I had every reason to believe that I would die inside. So I wanted my children to have the benefit of everything that I had learned, every fear that I had, the things that I had not quite figured out, so they would know me. So I did those things. And in doing those things, the challenges that I faced did not come as much from the inmate population. My challenges came from staff. There's always an interest in preserving the status quo. You hear all the time how elated guards are with the existence of job security. Now, my thinking was, if I was a police officer, I would want to live for the day that my job was obsolete. I would think that a guard would feel that way too, but that was not the case. So I was a problem. I was a problem because I was trying my best to help young people who did not have life sentences get out, stay out, be present for their family, be accountable. You're not a handicap. You can do more than this. So my habit was to read a little fiction, nonfiction, and a subject about which I know nothing about every day to keep my mind relevant. And I gave that to them. So some of the challenges that I faced that you too may find completely unreasonable was we had a Swahili class that we taught. And I was told that we could not have that Swahili class because the BGF, which is a prison gang, the Black Guerrilla family, utilized Swahili for code. I said, so let me make sure I understand you, Captain. You are reducing my heritage to a felony because of a prison gang that you say utilized the language. He said, that's absolutely correct. I said, well, you teach Spanish classes. What does the Mexican mafia speak? That's him thinking. So we had Chinese classes. Triad, used Chinese. We had neo-Nazis and white supremacists, and they spoke English. We had English classes. So I was not willing to accept that as a legitimate reason. So they backed away from that. They lost that battle, but I became a bigger target. Then at Soledad prison, you could take a guitar to the yard, you could take an accordion to the yard, but you couldn't take congas to the yard. So I said, why? They said, they just don't let us. I said, well, if anyone tried, no, they're not going to let you. So I went and I checked out the congas. And I made certain to get behind the gentleman with the accordion as we exited the yard. Now, who can search an accordion? They took the accordion, handed it, let him walk through the metal detector. He was free on his way. I had congas that you could turn upside down and see the skin, nothing there. I put them there, they said, oh, you can't take that out. I said, why not? You just can't. An instrument just went to the yard. Yeah, but you can't take that out. Well, I need to speak with the sergeant. He's going to tell you the same thing. I'm okay to hear it twice. So the sergeant came. And I asked him. He said, well, that's a security risk. I said, why is it a security risk? He didn't have an answer. He said, we have to search these things. I flipped it upside down and said, searched. I said, did you search the accordion? Did you search the guitar? So what I came to understand is that their mindset was that if you did not claim your heritage, you forfeited. I wasn't willing to accept that. So he said, I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll let you take it out today. I said, that's not good enough. I need you to write a memo that this is not a threat to the safety and security of the institution, no more than a guitar and surely an accordion are. And after about 2 months of that fight, they did that. But I was a problem. Now, I find those things to be absolutely reasonable to ask. So, me being a target, I had a lot of problems with staff. And when you would file your 602s or your grievances, many times they would go to friends of the people that you were grieving. And it wasn't until a gentleman told me, he said, Dameion, why are you going to the devil to ask the demons to stop tormenting you? I was like, what do you mean? This is the way. He said, everyone has to answer to someone else. You got to take it out of here. So I didn't know how to litigate. So I took the monies that I had and I ordered a paralegal course from Personal Career Development Institute. And I learned how to file torts. And then I start winning. And that felt really good. So that gave me room and space to exist and help other people with legitimate grievances so that we could have a more harmonious environment. Because I was a firm believer that your community is where your feet are planted. And you can't wait to get out to be. You have to be. And when you get out, then you are. So that was my habit. So years after that, I found myself in Solano State Prison. Now, when I was at Solano State Prison, and mind you, I am a person who has never aspired in any way to be an actor at all. That was never a dream of mine, never a thought at all. Well, I went to the water fountain and I saw this form. It said Marin Shakespeare Company, drama classes. I wanted no part of that, Shakespeare. Didn't want that at all. But the way things tend to go inside is that if reputable names aren't on the list, people would just look at a class like it's nothing. Now, this was going on in San Quentin at a high level, but in Solano, it had not been heard of. So after seeing it empty a few days, I put my name on the list because I was somewhat reputable. And then the list was filled out. Well, when the day came that the passes came out to attend the class, I had no intention of going at all. And a friend of mine came up to my bed area and he's like, hey, I heard him call you for a ducat. A ducat is the pass to go to. He said, are you going to go? Absolutely not. Have fun. So he stayed at my bunk for a while and harassed me. And I was like, okay, I'll walk you down there, but I'm not going in. He said, okay, fair enough. So I walked him to the building. Now, when we got there, the yard had not been opened. And they had already run the unlock. And after running the unlock, which means the keying in for the inmates to attend, we were late. Now, when you're late and the yard isn't open, the door is locked, and you are considered out of bounds. So we got there, and the worst guard in the institution to catch Dameion out of bounds actually walked out of the central complex, and he saw me, and he was overjoyed to see me legitimately out of bounds. And I was going to the board in about 6 months. Now, what that would have meant, even though my record was good, what that would have meant was, Dameion, you were out of bounds, which means that you have shown that you cannot obey the rules and regulations of this institution. Therefore, how can we trust you out there in free society? 3-year denial, at least. So I knew that was coming. So when he got halfway to us, my friend, knowing that I was going to the board, he just started apologizing. I said, don't worry about that. I chose to come with you. It has nothing to do with you. When he got halfway there, Leslie unlocked the door. So when the door opened up, he said, you going to stay out here or you going to Shakespeare? I'm going to Shakespeare. So that's how I wound up in the class. So upon entering the classroom, I was really worried because there were gentlemen from various gangs who did not get along with one another. And there was a very volatile relationship in that room between two people where there had been serious injuries years past. And this is a four-wall, one-locked door, no guards, just little Leslie with a whistle and a panic button. That is no security whatsoever. Now, I didn't worry about anything happening to Leslie because contrary to what a lot of people think about prisoners, no one would try and hurt her. If any prisoner decided to be violent, it would be against another prisoner or a guard. It would not be against free staff unprovoked. But I was concerned that if these men attacked one another, of course, someone as small as Leslie could be hurt in the melee. So I was thinking that this was going to be the only class that ever came to this prison. So Leslie started out completely, it's seemingly oblivious to the relationships in the room, those dynamics. And she started giving these acting exercises. Now keep in mind, you are dealing with men. Some in years past have committed atrocious crimes. Some who were hardcore gang members. I mean, the best of the best in the worst kind of way. And Leslie looked at these men with these masks welded to their faces for years. And she said, now I want everyone to make a bird sound. Now, at that moment, everybody looked at her like she had lost her mind. But then they started to look around at one another. Like, now who's gonna do that? Hey, I had beat a 115. I could have gotten a write-up. I got in just in time. I was feeling good. So I made the bird sound. And everybody started laughing at me. And it was great because a lot of those men had not laughed genuinely in a long time. And I noticed there is something in the human spirit that happens when you have genuine happiness and laughter in your heart, and your eyes, the windows to your soul, is vulnerable, and you look across the room at the one that you called your enemy, and you are both disarmed. And that spark hit, you catch one another's humanity in that moment, and you could tell when it happened because people would disengage immediately, like, But it was there already. And I always consider that the first chink in the armor. Now, as we went on, we left out of that class, I heard many men saying, I'm not going back up in there. That's a bunch of bull. Because they felt something. They felt something that they had not given themselves the opportunity to feel. But after 6 days of the monotony of prison, on that 7th day, you're okay to try something different. So those men came back to the room. And now the stakes were upped a little bit more. Of course, you have familiars hanging with familiars. You have the pockets. And Leslie allowed that for a while. But after the buy-in started, then it was, okay, let's change partners. Now, you have, for instance, a Crip just not ready to, tango with the blood. But Leslie has these exercises, and they have some buy-ins, so there's this quiet conversation that goes on between men who are in prison who don't want free staff or guards to know what they're talking about. There are no words, but there are eyes and body language. So those eyes and those body language said, okay, we're going to do this. But ain't nothing here. We just going to get this out of the way so she'll be quiet. So it's a very distant dance that they do. But the joy of it all, after repeating this, it gets easier and easier to work with a different partner. And then the play that was chosen was Macbeth. Brilliantly chosen. Because you had men in that room, most of which were in that room for some theme that was involved in that story. So you also have men in the room who have never, ever shared what was in here with anyone out there. So after reading the story and being asked the very strategic question of what parts about this story resonates with you, you start hearing the betrayal. Well, the peer pressure. Well, my wife or my girlfriend told me that if I didn't do nothing, then I was a punk. Well, I just wanted more than I had. I was hungry. So people started for the first time speaking around the room because, believe me, in many of I can speak for my household and many of the friends that I grew up around in the South, there was an understanding. You do not talk to psychs. You do not share the intimate things that go on in your household because they was always the white power structure. They will never get out of your life if you let them in it. And I learned that lesson when my dad was deported. And I went with my mom to the welfare office now. Many would say that I was a Democrat coming up, but in the South, you have a lot of Republican ways. That thing about if you are able, you will work. You don't want welfare. You want to always go out and make things happen for yourself. That's the extent of my Republican existence, but it's present coming from California, Tennessee. Now, my mom went into that welfare office, and I went with her, and my mom's a very private and proud woman. My dad had been deported. Things were hard. And when the woman started asking my mother these questions, I was surprised when my mother answered the first one, but it was like pulling teeth. And then she asked the second question, and my mother avoided it. And she asked another question, and my mother said, I'm sorry. I shouldn't be here. She said, come on, baby. And I left. And she told me, she said, baby, don't you ever let them in your life. You let them in your life, they'll never get out of it. Those are the lessons that we had in a black family coming up. So psychiatrists could sit in front of us and ask questions. Most of us would never tell them the truth because we didn't trust them like that. Therefore, there's a lot of therapy that one misses out on because of the distrust. And you hold these things in your heart and they never get healed. Many in that room were in that room because they had heard, you ain't gonna never be nothing. You can't do this. That's for white folks. That's for rich folks. This is not you. And eyes adjust to the level of deficiency present. So if this is the bar that has been set for you, you'll jump just that high. So many people found themselves in prison. So as we're in there and Leslie is giving this wonderful clinic on acting, we knew we couldn't act. But she never said that. She never said, that's ridiculous. No, you're doing that wrong. When we did something that was absolutely ridiculous and wrong, she would say, that's one choice. Right? But that felt good because it did not lend itself to, I'm being judged. I'm being told once again, I'm not good enough. There's something I can't do. So hearing that, you start to, okay, well, maybe I can do it. And really hearing that that was good. Now you want to show someone else how to do it. There's always a child unserved in those situations in prison. And I think one of the brilliant things about Marin Shakespeare Company and the classes that Leslie brought is that many of those lessons spoke to that child untouched. And that helped men develop. Now, men were doing exercises with people who they considered enemies. They started to have the buy-in. Now, at this time, I was told that I would be going to the board soon. I knew I was. I went. I was found suitable. Now, that didn't mean anything because it was a split decision and they often take dates back. But I hoped. So I said to Leslie, being that I wasn't an actor, I said, give me the smallest role in the play. She gave me Macduff. That is not a small role. No. So I was like, well, why did she give me Macduff? I asked for the smallest role, but what she was doing, I was so excited about the potential of going home and being in the class and everybody seemed to be jiving that I started giving my all in the exercises. I shouldn't have done that if I didn't want the largest role, but I didn't know. And she was assessing skill sets. And so when I said that, she said, yeah, we'll see. So it was Macduff. Now, when I did get the okay that I was going, I said to someone that I'm not going to perform in the production because I'll be gone. Now, there was someone who had heard that. I don't know if you guys know the dynamics of prison, but in prison, it's not the blacks and the whites that are the most volatile people to put around. It is black men and Southern Mexicans. Now, there was a Southern Mexican gentleman in the group who had really put himself into the acting. And he was a bad actor. In his group, no pun intended, he's a great artistic actor, but his gang life, he was definitely reputable. Someone came to my building one day. Two young men came up and they were alarmed, high anxiety, and it was like, hey, that's a Southern Mexican out there that's asking for you. Now, that didn't happen much. It didn't happen that a Southern Mexican would send word by a black gentleman to get a black gentleman because the first thing that's going to go up is, well, what's up? What's happening? Because these are supposed to be enemy forces. So I said, if he asks for me, I'll go. Don't worry about it. I'll deal with it. So when I go out there, it's my friend. And he's pacing. He apologized about 5 times for doing that because he understood the stakes. And he said, man, I heard that you wasn't going to perform in the play. He said, now that's fine. But if you don't do it, I can't do it. So just let me know either way. Now that's when I had to accept the responsibility of putting my name on that list as a reputable person. That other people put their names on the list. Other reputable people. So he said, you're not going to do it? Don't do it. Just let me know what you're going to do. Now, what was clear to me was he had found something in this class that he valued so much that he was willing to let go of those things that had defined him previously, those things that had condemned him previously, for the potential of discovering that he could do more. And we had already made a pact inside of that class that is not permitted. Men in that class made up an agreement that, hey, what happened in here, stay in here. You can't make pacts with enemy gangs. So that was already an issue, but men had already crossed that line because they were that much invested. But when he said that, I knew I had, there are so many moments that we miss by not paying attention to what's happening. In that moment, here was a man asking for an opportunity to do something different, something better, something higher that he believed in. And it came down to whether or not I was going to do the play. A person who didn't have the same stakes because I was not in a gang. I was not under pressure. It would have been easy for me to just be selfish and I'm not going to do it. But I told him, I said, I give you my word. As long as I draw breath and I'm on this line, I will participate 100%. I don't know what the board's going to do. They could take it. But I'll be there. He said, your word's good enough for me. So when we went back in, then I had to learn all them lines. It's a lot of lines, but I had to learn all those lines. And after doing that, then since everyone was on board, we knew that we had more time outside of that room than inside of that room. And we wanted to do it right. So we had to decide that we were going to go out on the yard and use that time to perfect this performance. There were stakes for that. A lot of people didn't know what we were doing in there because no one spoke on it. It was the first time that it had come to that prison. It was only one catch. We're going to go out here on the yard tonight and we're going to do this in front of everybody. But everybody has to be there. No one gets to hang back off the labors of the other's sacrifice. Now, this may not sound good, but it is true. And oftentimes, true things can be ugly. There is sometimes a silver lining to the dark cloud of violence. And when we went on that yard that night, and everyone showed up on that yard, you had men who had lived a life before Shakespeare. And the different gangs saw their members out here with mixing with other gangs. Now, the first people to be alarmed were the guards. So they came out and searched us several times and saw that we had no weapons. They didn't understand what was going on. So they went back, sit against the wall, call some extra guards, as they do from other yards, because they're sure something's about to happen. That's how irregular it was to see these factions mingling. And then you saw the factions of the gang members on the yard grouping up, trying to figure out what was going on. So then the first to come up and accost was a gang member who, well, he was a foot soldier sent by a gentleman who had been down over 30 years. And he came up to his fellow gang member. And when he walked up to him, he said, man, what you doing? What y'all doing? And everybody stood beside this man and said, we are running our lines for the Shakespeare production. Now, you have to consider that these men had a life before this night. Many of these men taught those men who would come to them how to behave badly. So it was a career decision that they were making. Are you going to poke the lion? All of these guys are together. We had decided that we were going to go to the infirmary together, the hole together, but we were not going to stop doing what we were doing. And they knew each and every one of us well enough to know that that's what it was going to be. And they decided to leave us alone. So they went on about their business. We were allowed to practice and work and get this production up, and we wanted to just be over. We wanted to be over. And we knew they were going to come. Some of them were going to come. And that night when we delivered that performance, none of us considered ourselves actors. I was impressed with every man in that show. And it was so strange that the gentleman who first sent a foot soldier to accost the member in the Shakespearean group stood up and was crying. And he said, I don't know how you guys did that. He said, this is one of the best days I ever experienced in prison. Now, this was the man who sent someone to break this up. But when he said that, then other people started saying, well, how could you do that? They saw men in a light that they had never seen them before. And it felt good to be seen in that light. And as much as we wanted to get that performance over with, all we could think about after that is how well we could do it if we could do it again. What would we do different to improve it? And everyone saw a higher potential in themselves. Then after that, all of those men, and I can speak for our group. I don't know what happened after me. I paroled shortly after that. But in that group, every member who was a member of a gang in that group, none of them went back to their gang. Not a single one. I have not seen that in any other self-help group in prison. I have not seen it. Not completely turn over to a pro-social existence. And there's much money spent in those groups, thinking for change, criminal thinking, anger management, all of those, they teach to the test. You can answer those things. You know how to talk that talk just by sitting in a room. But when you're in a room with people who you consider your enemy, is like being in a room with someone who you see counting their money in a wallet that don't belong to you. Can you coexist or go back to your bad habit? Those men made that choice to move higher. And after that, as hard as it was to get us and keep us all in that room, now we have wait lists for people trying to get inside of Marin Shakespeare Company's acting program. That is profound change. And that really highlights the power of arts and corrections and the ability of arts to change frequencies of people. Now, when I left out of there, I came back to speak, as we tend to do. We come back into the institutions to share what was myths, what were realities of what one may face upon their release. If you are a black man, when you go back in, you expect it to be full of black people. If you're a white man, you expect the same. When I went back inside, everyone was in the auditorium. And it was so irregular. I asked a friend of mine who was still there, I said, why is everyone here? Did they make this mandatory? And that was a very legitimate question. And he said, no, man, it's been this way ever since the Shakespeare program was here. So that is real empirical data on how this can change lives. Now, upon my release, I decided that I was going to do everything in my power to deprive prisons of the lifeblood that feeds them. I was determined to do that. In my first job, I was living in a halfway house in Turk and Taylor in San Francisco. I was walking to the sheriff's department every day as a high-risk case manager for young people in San Francisco. And I loved it. I loved it. But it's always bitter and sweet because it's real work. And I was told by all those who taught me of the case management that you can't get too close. You have to use a long-handled spoon sometimes because if you get too close, you get burnout. I have yet to find a way to do this type of work with gloves on. These young people are broken, damaged, and because too many gloves have handled them, they struggle. So I decided to do things different. Now the range of experiences has gone from master degrees from USC, the young people that I work with, to a funeral. And one of the hard things that I experienced was after a read of Othello, I was driving back to San Francisco. And I went through the Fillmore and there was a bunch of yellow tape. And I said, man, something bad happened out here. So when I got back into the office the next day, the Scram department, which is a department that attaches the ankle monitors to young men, women, it said, Dameion, you lost a client yesterday. Now I had 40 high-risk young men. And I still think this comes from refusing to wear gloves, to really touch, feel, and be present for people. I said, please say it wasn't this particular young man. They said, that's who it was. That hurt. That hurt badly, and I never thought that I would feel that much that quickly. And it wasn't until I grabbed his file and I was like, well, what do I do with this? He said, well, you put deceased on it, and I just couldn't, the dam just burst. And the tears just, I was angry at myself as to how I couldn't stop them. And he had come to me a couple weeks earlier. And he said, I need to go somewhere. And I tell him, I agree. People are trying to kill you. San Francisco is 7 square miles. The earth is spacious. You need to go somewhere. He said, well, how would I do that? I don't have anything. I have no money. What do I do? And I didn't have an answer. I didn't have an answer. And he said, just pray for me, brother. I said, son, what are you doing that I have to pray for you every time you walk out of here? He said, it's my life. So when I saw that, that crushed me. But what crushed me more was my discussion with one of his probation officers. After I looked at his Scram report, he had been out of bounds in places that he shouldn't have been in over 90 times and had not been picked up. And I said, why wasn't he picked up? He should have been picked up a long time ago. And God is my witness, these were her words. Well, you know the only reason he lived this long is because we kept picking him up. I felt I could only take that one way. Your paperwork ends now. File him away and just leave him to his fate. That hurt. And the day of his funeral, I was preparing to go for his funeral, and I got a call from the office that I worked for that said there's a young Hispanic kid in Oakland that's 12, and he's headed down the wrong path, and we need you to come and talk to him. Now I was faced with, I'm dressed for a funeral, and I have a 12-year-old who's still around, and I chose the 12-year-old. And I still get flack for that today. But that's the work. And now with Marin Shakespeare Company going inside of the juvenile prisons in Stockton and Alameda Juvenile Hall every week, we have the opportunity to continue that because this program exists. And I believe I was dealing with one of the Branson students, and they asked me a question that I had never considered, and I will close with this. He said, "You've won acting awards. You were up for auditionings in Black Panther. How do you feel about all that success?" And it was at that moment, hearing that question, that I realized that I've never considered that to be success. I'm not saying that I'm not grateful, that I don't appreciate that, and that's not something that I am happy to have experienced. But it was with that question that I realized that the way that I've measured success and failure was by the promise I made to myself the day I walked out of prison. I would do everything in my power to deprive prisons of the lifeblood that feeds them. That's how I measure. And that's why I do the work that I do. And that's why I'm grateful for Marin Shakespeare Company helping with that. I thank you all so much for your time, and I thank you for listening. I'm sorry, were there any questions, or did I keep y'all way past the time?
People feel we can take some questions. I think one of the most amazing things about this program, the Arts and Corrections and Shakespeare in particular, is that it brings humanity to a place that is meant to dehumanize. And so and again, bringing men together who would never be together in prison. And the community they create is one of the things I've been most moved by as I go in and work and watch the transformation that happens. It really is a truly transformational program. Does anyone have any questions they'd like to ask?
Great.
How do the kids respond to this class?
Oh gosh, I mean they are blown away.
And there's a cool pose that exists amongst young people. And Shakespeare does not fit the requirement of the cool pose. So one experience that we had in Chad, we were in Chad juvenile prison. There's a difference between the juvenile prisons and juvenile hall. And in juvenile prison, there was this young man who, you can easily identify the leader when a group comes into the room. You see who kisses the ring. And this guy was quiet. When he spoke, it was something sarcastic, and everyone was obligated to laugh. But he was also the guy that would have moments of extreme intelligence, that he would just remind you that you may think because I'm being disruptive that I'm an idiot, but I want you to know that I'm much smarter than you may think. And I love that. So it was him that needed to be moved in order for the rest to follow along. So I started to talk to him. Of course, you can't do this work without sharing things. I have 23 years of prison experience, and he had seemed to be on his way to trying to equal that. So I needed to let him know where the potholes were. So in talking to him, there was some legitimacy and validation that, okay, maybe I care. So then he started putting in the effort, and then everyone else started putting in the effort. So Leslie decided on the day of the performance that they were going to do, she decided to bring sports coats. She brought the sports coats. Now these kids, when they came in the room, every one of them, when they came in, they saw the sports coats, they was like, putting that square stuff on, not putting that on. So they sit there like, we're going to do this, but we're not wearing that. And this guy who's the alpha personality. He got up and he went over and he looked at him. And as fate would have it, he grabbed the jacket that seemed like it was tailor-made for him. And he put it on, and he looked good in that jacket. And it was striking. I said, man, that looks like it was made for you. He's like, for real? It's like, yeah. So then he went, and the rest of them saw him in it, and they had to agree. So then gradually, all started making their way over to the jacket list. So they all put the jackets on, and then to see them in the restroom pushing each other out of the way, looking at themselves, was just delightful. And after the performance was done, he pulled me to the side because the cool pose is there. He can't let his friends hear this. He said, hey, Dameion, do you think when I get home you could, and he looked around to make sure, you think you can help me, show me how to pick out a suit? I don't know anything about that, how to tie a tie. I said, absolutely. I could have cried. And he said that. He saw himself in a way that he had never seen himself before. So they receive it well when you show them the relevance. And one of the easiest ways to get to them with Shakespeare is to remind them, all of them, even though Tupac was a generation away from them, they know Tupac. And when they find out that Tupac was an avid studier of Shakespeare, then he becomes relevant to them.